You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Matthieu, and today's episode is a little different, which is why I'm hosting it instead of Chris. We're doing a remake of an early episode of this podcast, which was all about how the hosts got into cinema. Since then, we've had new voices join the podcast, myself included, so we decided to hear from the people who were not on that episode. To that purpose, I'm joined by three wonderful co-hosts, Lauren, Saul, and Adam. The ones among you with the best memories might notice that Adam was already in the original episode, but this is Adam from New York, not Adam from Scotland. So it's all new content. With that out of the way, let's start on a simple, but possibly difficult to answer question. What is your first memory of watching a film?
Hi, this is Adam from New York. Matthieu, I'm going to disappoint you. I don't have a memory of watching a first film. What I can say is I don't remember my first movie, but I know what it was. As a very small child, my mother tells me I was obsessed with the classic Disney movie Dumbo. So much so even that she got tired of renting it from the video store and just bought the VHS. And I apparently watched it dozens of times. Again, I'm talking about as you know, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. But I have absolutely no memory of the movie. And what's more, I've never really become interested in classic Disney. It's by far the earliest Disney movie I saw my entire life until I saw Fantasia this year. So I guess it would be a real outlier in my cinema interests, but it was technically, from what I've heard, the first movie I've seen. I just don't remember it.
Hi, it's Saul from Australia. The earliest film that I remember seeing is a tricky question because I've been told quite a few times by my parents which film I saw first. So I don't know if I actually remember seeing it or whether them telling me that again and again has sort of put in my mind that I do actually remember being there. Anyway, the film was The Adventures of Milo and Otis. It's a film from 1986, and I'm born in 1986, but I didn't see it as, like a 3-week-old infant or anything. It actually came out in Australia in 1990, so I would have been about 3 to 4 years old when it came out. So that's the earliest one that I know of. In terms of actual memories that I've got, rather than suggested memories by my parents, the earliest one I remember anything of is Cinderella, the Disney film from 1950. And that's not a case of me going back 36 years to watch it. It was re-released in Australia in 1991. So at that stage, I would have been about 4 years old. I just remember a couple of, scenes from the film, or even just a few shots, and maybe my position in the audience, which is kind of interesting. In terms of remembering a significant part of a film, I'm not sure. Probably the earliest I probably could think of would be something like Home Alone, which I would have seen probably for the first time in 1992 or 1993, shortly after it came out on home video. But that's a film, as we've discussed in previous podcasts, that have traumatized me a bit. I've seen it quite a few times over the years, so I don't know if I remember seeing it the first time or whether I've just got vivid memories of it because I would have watched it, 5 to 10 times while growing up. So, I don't really have a straight answer for that. There's a few other films a bit more recent than that I do remember, but it's sort of like I more remember, the experience of going there. Like I remember what the theater would look like when we went to see The Lion King in 1994 when I was about 7 years old, but I don't actually remember the film. Or I remember seeing Star Wars when it was re-released in 1997. I remember going into the theater. I don't actually recall the film, which I've since watched since then. So again, I've got a bit of false memories, blurred memories in there. A long-winded answer. I'm sorry, but for me, unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that one.
I'm Lauren, Mighty Sparks. Yeah, I don't really have a specific memory of a first film, but I asked my mum earlier today what she thought, and she said I was probably around 3, which would have been about 94. And she thinks it was probably some of the early Disney films and things like Land Before Time or The Aristocats or Cinderella. I do remember watching Land Before Time and Aristocats a lot when I was younger, but I don't remember really how old I was. I do know that one of the first films that I saw at the cinema was Babe, because my grandma took me to see it, and then she basically swore off eating bacon, and she only started eating bacon again in the last few years, which is kind of random. And when I'm trying to think about like my first sort of real memory, I do remember having a dream or a nightmare when I was around 4 to 6. I don't really remember. It all kind of burst together, which was kind of inspired by Total Recall. So I know I watched that quite early. And the memory, I mean, the dream is sort of like, I only have a vague memory of it. But I remember there was this kind of like space station, airport type of thing overlooking Mars. And there were these like museum exhibit things with like brains in them. And the glass of the space station cracked, and then everything started going crazy, and that's like all I remember. So I know I was watching that kind of stuff quite early, but I don't actually remember watching the film itself. I just remember the dream.
That is really interesting, Lauren. And I guess, Saul, also, you both have kind of traumatic memories of watching things as a child or being influenced by what you had seen. And I guess Adam and I don't, probably because we just repressed it. I really don't personally just remember watching a film at all until I was like 10 or 11. But undoubtedly I did. I do remember that The Aristocats was my favorite Disney growing up, even though I wasn't watching many films. But the first one I really remember watching was in the cinema, like you, Lauren. And that was The Emperor's New Groove, which I guess is not the most renowned Disney film. But I remember loving it at that time anyway. And yeah, it's interesting that it's all Disney. I guess it's pretty predictable, but Disney really has quite the hold on children everywhere. But we don't really choose what our first film is, obviously. I mean, we all watch Disney films. We all remember our first memory is all Disney film, or in the case of Babe, it's not a Disney film, but it's a children's film. It's not us who choose to watch that. So I guess what I wonder now is, barring that, how did you really first get into movies? How old were you? When did it happen? And was there a particular film that was decisive in you really starting to be a cinephile or maybe exploring cinema more?
So for me, Matthieu, there was one distinctive movie, and it's interesting you mentioned this, the common theme of Disney in our childhoods, because I guess that's what parents in those days did when they needed something to distract their kids. These days, I see so many parents who just put an iPad in front of their kids and show them some sort of sing-songy nonsense on YouTube in order to, I don't know, get the TV to parent the kids for a while. I guess it was Disney back in the day. I think the first movie I saw in theaters might have been The Little Mermaid. And I can start remember going to the movie theaters around when I was, 5, 6, 1989, 1990. I remember seeing Home Alone. I remember seeing Back to the Future Part 3. So we were very much a movie-going family. But the one movie that really turned me into a cinephile, I guess, was Strangers on a Train. And I think I might have been about 8 or 9 years old. And I just remember sitting at home with my dad, and it came on the TV. I want to say it was on a classic movie channel. Maybe it was on AMC, which is sort of a classic movie channel here in the United States. And he asked if I wanted to see it with him. And I said, sure. And I was just totally entranced. I don't know up until then how many sort of older movies I had seen, but it felt it was so stylish. It was so full of these sort of delicious crime scenario of these, two bachelors who are switching murders for each other. It begins with this strange, intriguing encounter on a train. And it was my introduction to Hitchcock. And I was totally entranced, and I became obsessed after that with Hitchcock. And that's how I really sort of became very interested in movies.
Yeah, Strangers on a Train is a great one. Definitely one of my favorite Hitchcocks as well. And Hitchcock is also, I guess, one way that many of us get into movies, or at least an early stage for a lot of cinephiles. Very accessible and very well known. But anyway, what about you, Saul?
So this was an interesting question, so I decided I would chat to my mum today about it and see what she recalled of me. And what she said is that from as young as she can remember, I was always interested in films. As a child or as a infant or whatever, I was very, hard to control and get interested. But if there was something showing on TV or she sat me from the TV, I'd get fixated on that quite easily. And she even recounted some stories about, how I'd go to the park with my younger brother and I wouldn't want to go on the slides or anything. So I wasn't a very physical person, but I was very entranced by cinema. And she's often given me stories about how when I was really young, they'd take me to the movies and I'd sort of like run out to the very front of the theater with the big screen and sort of just like look up at that big screen and just be really fascinated by the whole projection of it, which I guess as a younger child compared to when I do it now, and I do occasionally still wander the front now when I'm getting a bit bored and nobody else is in the theater, and it must have just seemed massive back then. But definitely from a very early age. I definitely remember when I was maybe 8, 9 years old, I started to keep a record of the films that I was watching and just putting stars on them because I used to be obsessed with the TV guides and seeing what movies were showing and trying to watch, the 4 or 5 star films because, as you know, an 8 or 9 year old, that's, that was my reference point for whether the film's worth watching or not. And then I liked keeping a record of my own ratings, which was all kind of interesting. But I don't think it was really until I was about 13 or 14 years old that it really came and really turned from being just, interested in keeping track of ratings to actually seeking out films that are a little bit different, the more acclaimed films out there. And if I was going to give a film that probably started my cinematic journey as a hardcore cinephile, I wish I could say Strangers on the Train because that's an amazing film. It's my favorite Hitchcock after Rear Window, Vertigo, and Psycho. So after the big three, I think it's Hitchcock's best one. So I wish I could say Strangers on a Train, but it's not Strangers on a Train. I wish I could say that, but it's not. The film that did it for me was, it's hard to say without laughing, it's called Godzilla versus the Sea Monster. And I don't know what it was about that. Maybe because it was just such a strange and weird film or whatever, but that was the first one where I decided that I wouldn't just, put like a rating for it, I'd also write a bit about it. And I started doing that for films I watched since then. The amount that I write about a film has changed a bit over the years. I mean, over the last, 15 years or so, it's been pretty consistent. But for the first few years, just getting into it, I think it was the film that really did it to me, that I was interested in actually, trying to form an opinion and then keeping a track of my opinions of what I was watching.
I'm glad it wasn't Strangers on a Train. That would have been both odd and, well, I kind of feel like it's my movie.
I feel like you would have to commit a murder together if that was the case.
Yeah, although I should just mention with the Hitchcock one, Hitchcock was very pivotal for me early on. My mum introduced me to Hitchcock when I was first really getting into films. So even though I have said, Godzilla versus the Sea Monster, that would have been when I was maybe 13. I was definitely watching Hitchcock films as young as 10 because when we were 10 years old, we went to Disney land and we saw in Universal Studios, we saw how they did that tail scene in Saboteur, and I had seen Saboteur at that stage. I'd seen Psycho, Rear Window, North by Northwest, Vertigo, so I'd seen the big ones. So I'd definitely seen some Hitchcock by, age 10 or 11, but I guess it was only, when I got into high school that I started to get into more of, I just don't want to have star ratings. I actually want to have an opinion on everything that I watch.
But
well, it makes me wonder, is Hitchcock a director of children's movies then?
Very violent children, I guess. And very sexually obsessed too.
It depends on the Hitchcock film, but I think Hitchcock's a good primer for older films because I guess, or older films in inverted commas or whatever, because that's often hard to introduce. But I guess because he was the master of suspense, a lot of his older films, especially stuff like North by Northwest, which is probably the first Hitchcock I saw, is just it's a very gripping ride, even though it's not, a sort of modern film, whereas otherwise it's really hard to get, I guess younger people have never seen older films before to watch them. I mean, when I'm showing films to my students as a teacher, I usually go for comedy because comedy is fairly universal. But in terms of more serious stuff, something like Hitchcock is a pretty safe one to go to because they're so suspenseful, they're so thrilling. I don't want to put on something like The Grapes of Wrath, which somebody did on the classic film board. It was insisted on showing that to his grandchild, and then asked the grandchild afterwards, "What do you think of it?" And apparently the grandchild was just like, "Oh, it's good" or whatever. But you don't show that to a 10-year-old, not to introduce them to older films.
Yeah, clearly you have to show them Godzilla movies. Was that the first Godzilla movies you saw? That one that was the trigger, son?
I don't think it was. I think I did see the 1998 version of Godzilla when it first came out on VHS, I guess. It would have been before DVD. So I guess in maybe 98 or something, I would have seen it. But I've got no memory of it. I haven't rated on IMDb. The only stuff I've rated on IMDb I've kept track of is the film since Godzilla versus the Sea Monster. But yeah, I did see the Roland Emmerich one when it came out.
All right. So, Lauren, is your first major, like, decisive film more Strangers on a Train or more a Godzilla film?
Well, I don't know if there's a specific film, but it was probably closer to a Godzilla film. So, like, when I was a kid, I always liked movies, but I didn't really get into them until my, like, early teens. So, as a kid, it was pretty much like every week my dad would go to the video shop and would rent a bunch of movies, and then we would watch them over the week. So it was just whatever he rented, we watched. I had no idea about TV guide movies, or I didn't watch movies on TV. So it was just whatever he rented. And because he liked horror, it was always horror films. I don't know if there was a specific movie though, because I just don't really remember enough about sort of my first films that I watched when I was a kid. But I just know that, like, even as like a young kid, like 4 or 5, I wanted horror films. But we also never watched any foreign films or any black and white films. So I never watched Hitchcock as a kid. My first Hitchcock was when I was 14, and I don't think I would have liked it as a kid. And yeah, so as a kid, I mean, I liked them, but I wasn't really hardcore into them until my teens. And I think it was probably what really kind of sparked it off as being like, when I knew that this was going to be my passion, was sort of the first few films that I watched when I found the top 250. And that was like The Godfather, Singing in the Rain, Frankenstein, and then One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which instantly became my favorite movie and has been since. So could say maybe it's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or it's just kind of all of them, and realizing like there's more to film than just whatever my dad rents.
It's interesting that you mentioned the IMDb top 50, because it was talked about a lot in the first episode, where apparently all the hosts really got into the IMDb top 50, which was quite surprising to me, because for me it wasn't a factor, but we can maybe talk about that a bit later. As for me, my path, my road to being a cinephile to movies was, I think, a lot more long-winded than you all. Partly because we didn't really watch many movies in my family. Again, some Disney when I was a child, but that's about it. And then when I was a teen, there were some movies I watched and loved, like Princess Mononoke and Pulp Fiction, City of God, stuff like that. Well, different stuff really, but I never really got into movies despite those films I loved. I think in part because I know I'm an obsessive person, and if I'm going to get into something, I'm really going to get into it, and I'm going to need to, explore the history of it and see the classics and all that. I guess we all feel that to a certain degree, but to me, it was a stumbling block, because I felt that I didn't want to get into cinema because of that, right? I didn't have the time or whatever. So really, when I was a teen, I still did not get into movies. And instead I got, when I was maybe 18, into TV. Because I don't know why, I guess it felt more accessible to watch like The Sopranos and The Wire, to watch the big classics, even though, if I think about it, the time it took me to watch all of The Sopranos, I could have watched a bunch of movies as well. I mean, it's really long either way. And so I got into movies through listening to podcasts, really, because I was listening to TV critics podcasts, and a lot of the TV critics, really, they talk about movies as well, because, they're pretty related. And so eventually that led me to film podcasts, like Film Spotting and stuff like that. And eventually, hearing about those films that were going on, I wanted to watch them as well. And all of this is quite recent compared to you, because 2015 would really be the big year when I got into movies, I would say. And if there was one film to single out, it would probably be Boyhood, which is a film I love, but not in my top 20 of all time, right? But a film I do love, though I haven't seen it since then. And yeah, seeing that, I guess it makes sense that coming from loving TV, I would love Boyhood, because it has kind of the same strength of being this very long-term character study, right? Where you see a character evolve, which is kind of what the appeal of long TV shows, character-based TV shows are. And so yeah, I guess that was the triggering film for me. And also, the other thing that attracted me to it is the idea of being part of the conversation, right? everyone was talking about that film at that point, or at least it felt like it. And so, yeah, I wanted to be part of that. And then immediately, because of what I discussed earlier, I started watching all the films, watching like big classics, like again, you mentioned The Godfather, that I saw it around that time. So yeah, I guess I came into movies a lot later than you guys did. And to jump back on the IMDb Top 250 thing, really it was not a big factor for me. I think because I came into the movies, as I said I did, I guess I had heard about it a lot earlier, and mostly derisively, right? Mostly for people to say, haha, the idea of The Shawshank Redemption is the best film of all time, that's ridiculous. That's what I heard anyway, whether or not you agree is another question. I think it's fine, I guess. But yeah, so for me, the IMDb Top 250 was not really a big source. And I guess because in the previous episode, it was talked about a lot, I wonder, was it for you guys, the IMDb Top 50?
For me, I was never interested in the IMDb Top 250. It never occurred to me as something I was particularly interested in, and to this day, I'm still not really interested in. And this is perhaps a shocking confession, considering the websites that I know we all go to, but I'm not really interested that much in movie lists. I've never felt the need or the interest in completing a movie list. I certainly don't dislike them as a reference point for finding movies, but I've never really been into lists.
Well, that is a shocking revelation. I guess there's not one list for me, but yeah, I do love myself some lists, be it movies or otherwise.
So, like Adam, the IMDb Top 250 wasn't a big starting point for me because, I'd got into film before, I discovered the internet. So, after I went beyond what was listed in the TV guides for films, I actually went and found some cinema guides at the library. And the one that really struck me the most was the Halliwell's Film Guide because it was so massive. It covered so many films of so many different eras. And the only way I actually found IMDb would be when I was about 13, and one of the films that I was looking for wasn't listed in the Halliwell's Film Guide. And the only way I could find information about it was by searching for it online, which brought me to IMDb. The film, when I searched for it on IMDb, I didn't even recognize it because on IMDb, the title is She Says She's Innocent. The title of the film that I had on VHS was called Violation of Trust, and it took me a few minutes to realize that was an AKA title and it had been retitled for video release. So I haven't seen that film in 21 years. It's not even, I don't even have it voted for on IMDb because it's before I created an account there. I'm not surprised that Laura and other people haven't heard of it because I hadn't heard of it. It was just one that I managed to, pick up from on VHS. Yes, it's a 991 TV movie. It's got no significance other than the fact that it directed me to IMDb. That's the most famous thing that film has ever done for anyone is get sold on IMDb.
It's on the movie's gravestone, I'm sure.
I should add that as a trivia item on the film's IMDb page. And the trivia item would actually be accepted because of the way they've automated everything. So if I really wanted to trash the IMDb website, I could do that, but I've got better things to do. So no, the IMDb Top 250, I'd already been looking at the 3 and 4 star films on the Halliwell's Film Guide. That's how I'd been choosing what to watch. The IMDb Top 250 was interesting, but it wasn't too interesting because there are a lot of very new films in there, and I already knew quite from early on that this wasn't a very good reference point. So, occasionally it was interesting. It was something which I didn't realize was in the top 250, but for the films towards the top, and especially the new releases that kept getting in there high enough, it just was never an interesting launching point for me. And like Adam, lists are interesting to me, but I've never been much of a completist. That's what I like about ICM, I Check Movies, that you can get an award for getting 50% or 75% on a list because that's really, my interest point. I'm not interested in completing everything. I don't know if it's coming from the point of view that I don't want to run out of things to see. That might be it. I'm not sure, but I've never had any interest in finishing or completing lists. And even with director filmographies, with directors that I like a lot, like Cronenberg, it took me quite a few years to actually get through everything that he'd done because, you always, want something else there. But, sometimes with people like the Coen brothers, you just end up watching everything because it's all so great. But yeah, I've never really been big into list completion or filmography completion, although I know that's one of the big things that people on the forum are interested in. I know it breaks Lauren's heart, but it's a reality for me.
Yeah, I guess I'm not that much of a completist either, probably more than you. I do feel some satisfaction at, getting virtual awards on ICM and stuff like that. But yeah, it's not a huge deal for me either. But I did immediately use a lot of lists when I got into movies. And the way I would do it, I think I checked movies relatively early. And so it was always more I checked movies than IMDb for me. And I would take a bunch of lists. I think the IMDb Top 50 was part of it, to be fair. But you also had They Should Pick the Sunday and the Palme d'Or winners and stuff like that. I don't remember all the lists. And I would just randomize, right? And so that's how I ended up watching not the biggest classics first. I mentioned on the Godard episode that the first film by Godard I saw was Numéro 2. And that's why. It's because it came up randomly. And I thought that was a way to kind of be exposed to a bunch of different things without just doing the classics. And there was a weighting system. I mean, whatever, it's boring, but yeah, so that the classics would come up more often still, right? So that I wouldn't just watch obscurities. But Adam, you said you're not at all into lists. So I guess I wonder, how did you decide which films to watch when you first got into it?
My formative influence was my father. I think after seeing Strangers on a Train, I bugged him for movie recommendations. I think I drove him a little bit crazy, and at some point he ran out and just got a little frustrated with this constant demand for new movies. And the movies he was suggesting were, I guess you could say, sort of stereotypical guy cinema, male cinema, if you want. A lot of Westerns, a lot of war movies, a lot of spy movies. The funny thing is that's not his taste at all anymore. He's changed quite a bit, and I've changed quite a bit, but my favorite movies in my youth were movies like High Plains Drifter, which is still one of my favorite movies. The James Bond movies. There was a point when I was probably, 8 years old where The Spy Who Loved Me was my favorite movie, which I find a little mortifying today. And then there was these sort of classic 60s war movies like The Guns of Navarone, Where Eagles Dare, Stalag 17. I still love these movies, and I think they hold up very well to my eyes today as an adult. But those are sort of the movies I just adored as a kid. And I was, fairly obsessed even at a young age. I remember I had a sort of weekend routine. Friday evening, I'd go to the video store, I'd rent 2 movies. I'd watch one Friday evening, I'd watch one Saturday morning. Saturday, I'd go back to the video store and repeat it. 2 more movies. Watch one Saturday evening, watch one Sunday morning. So I try to consume 4 movies during the weekend. And I don't think that's very exceptional considering the movie consumption rate at our forum. I think you won't find many 10-year-olds who do that. So it was mainly my father who influenced me in terms of the movies I was choosing.
Yeah, and that brings me to ask, it sounds like you were mostly watching on TV, essentially, either by renting DVDs or by watching something that was airing. And Saul, you mentioned TV Guide being this important thing. So did you all get into movies mostly by watching them on TV? What about you, Lauren, for example?
So I very rarely watch TV. So I pretty much never watched any films on TV. It was purely whatever we rented from the video store. And yeah, like Adam, as a kid, my dad was the main influence on what I watched. But then in 2005, when I was about 14, I found the top 250. I actually joined IMDb the year before, but somehow I must have found the top 250 and started watching that. But unlike everyone else, I didn't even know about film books or film critics or anything. So I never knew of any critics. I never read any reviews, or I didn't know what was popular. I didn't know what the classics were. So the top 250 was literally the only thing I knew in terms of recommendations for films that I should watch rather than films my dad chose to rent. And I love lists and completing lists, although it usually takes me a long time. And I guess it's the same sort of reason, even though I've tried to read critics and look at these books and things like that, I just haven't found anyone that I really connect with, taste wise. They don't seem to watch films the same way that I do or like films the same way that I do. So for me, lists are kind of especially those big aggregate kind of lists where it's not just one person saying this is what you should watch. It's kind of just here's a bunch of films that lots of people like, and you might like them as well. So I just have this sort of like pick of the litter. Like to me, it's like random, but it's not as random as just like actually picking something at random. And it's a lot more, even though it's still hit and miss, it's a bit better as a recommendation system than what I used to do, which was go to the horror section at the video shop and pick something with a cool cover, because 90% of the time it sucks. So the lists are just kind of helpful for me to sort of guide my way. But that's just because I haven't really found any film people whose recommendations like mean enough to me to use that.
Yeah, so I guess you all really have that connection to like video stores and watching on TV. I guess probably because I got into movies as an adult at a time where video stores were already kind of a thing of the past. I mean, they still exist, but they are more rare. It was mostly going to the theater, especially starting in late 2015, and yeah, watching films on the internet in perhaps less than legal ways, which I don't do as much now. So yeah, I guess the difference in time really made a huge difference in what we watched, because of that, it was kind of an infinite amount of possibilities for me. So I didn't really go. You mentioned not finding critics that you can really trust and you really have the same taste. I don't think I have that either. I guess I just kind of look at an aggregate and try to pick, oh, that sounds interesting because a bunch of different people like it. One other thing I kind of wonder about is, Adam, you mentioned that your father mostly introduced you to very masculine type of films, and that now your taste is very different. And so I guess my question is, how did that happen, right? How did you branch out? How did you explore things that were outside of that group?
That's a good question. I want to be clear. I don't want to draw a caricature of my father at all. His tastes are varied and wide, as are my mother's, and they've both been influential. You know, beyond just sort of the war movies, the Western movies, I was watching all of Hitchcock. I sort of went through as much Hitchcock as was possible once I saw Strangers in a Train. I did get into the Marx Brothers movies at a certain point, and the Chaplin movies, and I'm guessing that was more my mother's influence and her recommendations to me. And then at high school, my tastes broadened out a bit. I remember going to high school, and my history teacher delightfully dedicated several class sessions to just having us all watch Agira, The Wrath of God, which was mind-blowing for me when I was 13 or 14 years old. So then I watched a bunch of Herzog movies. Moreover, there was a fine arts club at school that decided to show a film festival of Kubrick movies. So I got into Kubrick. And then I created my own movie club in high school. It wasn't a very active club, but we did occasionally screen movies. I particularly remember was the tradition at the end of the year, the freshman class a trip to Six Flags, which is an amusement park with roller coasters. And I set up an alternative end of year day, which would just be a movie day. And we go to school and watch movies. And I can tell you, most people chose Six Flags over hanging out with me and watching old movies. But I remember our lineup on that day was Half Baked, stoner comedy. It was The Godfather. And what was the third one? I can't recall. I think it must have been a Coen Brothers movie. So gradually my tastes and interests broadened out.
Right, so it sounds like your initiation, I guess, into movies was very social. That through movie clubs, and I guess your father, that's a little different. But for me, it was a very lonely thing, I guess. Maybe a little sad. I guess I wish I probably had access to film clubs, but not at a time where they would have interested me much. And yes, so what about Lauren and Saul? How did you branch out of the things that interested you at first? Like Lauren, you mentioned the IMDb Top 50. Obviously now, from what I know of you, your tastes are not really along those lines, right? So how did you really get into genre cinema?
But that was well before I found the Top 250. That I was into horror from when I was like a toddler. So for me, the top 250 was a way of branching out of what I was interested in. But horror and genre films in general are still like my go-to. They're still my main interest. And they're still pretty hit and miss for me, but I feel like I'm more likely to find something worthwhile in them, some random top 250 film. Although the ones I have left, I don't think I'm going to like. And I don't think that my tastes have really changed significantly. Like the stuff I watched as a kid is still pretty much the stuff I watch now, like horror and sci-fi, but there's certain things that I could tolerate as a kid that I can't tolerate now, like that overly melodramatic music. I like it actually hurts me. But otherwise, I feel like I still feel like I'm pretty random with what I like and dislike. Like I'm always drawn towards genre films, but in everything else, it's like I might like a really long, slow film. I might like a really fast-paced superhero movie. I might hate them. I just never know. So I feel like my tastes have just they're just wibbly wobbly, and they always have been.
I've always been into horror. Not so much horror films, but when I was growing up, I was reading a lot of Goosebumps and Fear Street, a lot of R.L. Stein books. So I was always into horror, and I guess that naturally transferred over to horror cinema. And like Lauren, I would go to the horror section and I would look for the most striking front covers and the most striking back covers, could look at the images in the back also and make a decision based on that. Because obviously, well, not obviously, but I didn't take my Hollywood's film guide into the horror section with me to the video library. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. So it was just based on the front cover. I would do what attracted me. But yeah, that's how I was getting into film. And, you know, I was sort of like, I guess, a bit envious of Matthieu. He's been able to watch films directly online ever since he was into cinema, because yeah, that wasn't a thing for me back in the day. I mean, when I was first watching films and first, you know, even as like a 10-year-old going through and trying to find films, that was before DVDs had come out. And, you know, I still like remember hiring my first DVD and how different that was to watching a film on VHS. But yeah, for me, it was all about VHS. It was about hunting those VHSs down, hoping, you know, they work properly. And I just recall such things as, you know, going and renting the Maltese Falcon for the second time. But, you know, not like 1 week after another, but like I rented it and I wanted to rewatch it like 2 years later. And the person like looked it up and they're like, you know, you've rented this film before. I'm like, yeah, I want to see it again. But, you know, that was like way back then. I can't even imagine doing that now. But, you know, I guess going back, you know, 18 years ago or whatever that would have been, you know, that was the reality. You want to see something, you need to rent it. I mean, much of the films that I first saw growing up were the ones that were showing on TV, because I was only allowed to rent films during the school holidays. So if I wanted to see anything that my parents didn't own, and we didn't really own much, you know, during the week or during the weekend, I would just have to choose from what was showing on TV. So I saw a lot of old British comedies because they used to play on the ABC channel here. And yeah, I saw a lot of different classics because they would show them from time to time. But, you know, I was watching them with ads, which isn't ideal, but it's still a great, you know, primer for getting interested in films and getting in there. And then they would give me ideas about what to rent when the school holidays came up and I was able to go and rent things. But yeah, things have come such a long way since then, because, you know, it got to the point where VHS got wiped out and I got this gigantic 2,000 collection of VHS tapes because I all got them for like $1 or $2 when the video libraries were jobbing them out, and then getting those converted to DVD over the years, and like, so not converting, upgrading to DVDs over the years. And now it's got to the stage where 90% of what I watch, I'm streaming online. So everything for me has changed quite a bit. I think I've lost track of what the question was. I think it was in terms of finding or how my taste has evolved. Yeah, a lot of it is probably by being able to access things on streaming services. I think it's probably a big thing, or being able to import stuff from overseas. So not being limited by what I could rent in a video library or limited by what was showing on TV, but actually going out and say, well, you know, I actually want to, you know, buy these films from overseas. I want to buy these films on eBay that somebody else has imported from overseas. Or in the last few years, going out and streaming and going, well, like, Japan's doing a lot of crazy films. I like crazy films. For this Japanese challenge that we're going to have on the ICM forum in May, I'm going to stream as much stuff as I could find on Amazon Prime or on Netflix or whatever, which, you know, fits in this broad definition of crazy films beyond the actual Japanese classics. So I'm not quite sure if that answered the question. I've gone a bit off track, but you're welcome to redirect me if I need redirection.
I have a question for you, Saul, and a question for everyone. It's interesting you mentioned that your parents only let you rent movies during the school holidays. And I'm wondering if other people had an experience of to what extent their parents restricted their movie watching. I've heard from people over the years, whenever people meet me, they quickly learn I'm into movies. And then I often hear how they got into movies or to what extent they're interested in movies. And I often hear about something like, my parents didn't let me watch many movies growing up, or we weren't really a family that watched movies. So I had the opposite experience. My parents didn't restrict me at all in terms of watching movies. There's only one movie I can ever remember them saying you shouldn't watch that, and it was The Deer Hunter. Because I remember as a child asking my father what was the best movie he'd ever seen, and he said The Deer Hunter, and I said I want to watch that. And I think I was probably 9 years old, and they said, why don't you wait a few years? So that was the only time that I ever experienced them restricting me from watching a movie. Otherwise, sex, violence, they didn't feel a need to restrict me from that. And I'm wondering if other people had parents who are similarly, liberal or were more restrictive.
Well, I think 9 years old is actually a pretty good time to learn about Russian roulette. Okay, so that's a Deer Hunter joke. Yeah, look, my parents, I don't think, were ever too restrictive on what I was watching. I don't know. When I was renting films out, for a while, they didn't really want me renting anything out, which was MA or R, which are the two highest classifications. But, by the time I was 10 or 11 years old, they pretty much let me rent whatever I wanted to rent. In terms of being able to watch films, yeah, renting films was a school holiday thing. It was a special thing for the holidays. But they'll pretty much let me watch whatever was showing on TV, and they couldn't really control it to much of an extent, unless you're in the same room with me and they could go over and turn something off. But, if I'm home by myself or whatever and it's showing on TV, I guess, yeah, they didn't really think too much of it. So I don't think I was ever really restricted too much. I do remember one time when we were staying in Mandurah, which is a city near here, and we're on holidays, and one of the in-house, or what's it called, in-room movies or whatever, was rated MA, and I suggested we watch it, and they were like, no, but I would have been, I guess maybe 10 or 11 at the time, so maybe that was a sensible decision. But yeah, no, I don't think I've really been restricted too much in terms of the content of the films. It's more so that, we're not going to drive you to the video store and, spend so much money on whatever on renting these films. If you want to watch something, watch what's on TV.
Yeah, I didn't have any restrictions. Basically, like, I was allowed to sort of do whatever I want whenever I wanted. The only restriction that I had with movies was that I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated horror films, and everything that I wanted to rent was basically like rated M or MA, so I had to bring my parents every single time, and they had to take out the films because I was too young. But I remember specifically my parents were like, you can't watch The Evil Dead and you can't watch A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I did manage to convince them to let me watch The Evil Dead, and I was 7, and then I cried, and so then they were like, okay, you're definitely not watching A Nightmare on Elm Street now. But I remember by a few years after that, when I was like 10, I was just watching like everything. They never really cared. Like, I remember watching Irreversible with my dad, and what's that other one? I Stand Alone or something like that. So good family time with my family.
It's interesting you guys talk about ratings. Obviously, we have them in the US as well, but it would be generous to say that they're strictly enforced. At the video store, they never prevented me from renting anything I wanted. And movie theaters in New York City, in my entire life, I only once was prevented from seeing an R-rated movie as a child. They seem to have a policy of why turn away good money, which I appreciate.
Yeah, they're very strictly enforced here. I'm not so much sure about video libraries, but cinemas, they're very strictly enforced. I remember that I won free passes through this local television station to see Monsters Ball, the Halle Berry film, and that would have been early 2002 probably. So I was maybe around 15 years old, and it was rated R, and the person who was selling the tickets, was the ticket person, said, they actually get a personal fine, not the theater. The person who sells the ticket gets a personal fine if they let a minor into an R-rated film. So it might just be for the R's. I'm not sure if it's about the MAs, which is our second highest one, which is 15 plus. I know they're not allowed to sell them. I'm not sure if the fine's quite the same. In terms of renting, I'm not quite sure how much of an issue it is. I know with M, which is our third highest, it's only, recommended for mature audiences. So, pretty much anything G, PG, or M. I think you're able to rent as long as you've got, somebody else with you. So I never went to the video library by myself because it was never close enough to. So I always had a parent there anyway. But yeah, if I was to rent out an R by myself, I probably wouldn't be allowed to. And yeah, I wasn't allowed to see an R film by myself, and it hasn't changed either because it was also on the radio recently. There was one of those stupid blockbuster films that have come out recently. I don't know what it was, whether they're talking about it or whatever, and they'll try and take, their 15-year-old kid along to see it or whatever, and they weren't able to sneak them in. So it is quite strictly enforced here.
What about you,
Yeah.
Matthieu? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lauren.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I tried to rent, I think it was an M or an MA film, and I was 13 or 14, and they were just like, no, you need a parent. And my mum was waiting in the car, so I had to go out and get her and come back in, and then she had to take it out for me. And yeah, my dad brought me and my brother to see Scary Movie, which I think came out in 2001, so I would have been 10. And the people were trying to stop him from like taking us in. They were like, no, this is like really scary. Like, I think they're too young. And my dad was like, nah. And like, it wasn't even scary anyway. But, yeah. And I remember, I think I went to see like Jackass, but we went with a family friend and they wouldn't let us in because he wasn't our parent. So we couldn't see it.
Well, it's quite the opposite experience from what I was used to in New York. Matthieu, I'm interested in hearing if you had similar restrictions as youth. I know you said you only really got into movies when you were older, but did your parents restrict anything that you saw when you were young?
Well, not that I was aware of. Obviously, because I wasn't that much into movies, it wasn't a big factor, right? It's not like I was trying to see films that maybe would not have been appropriate. But also, the other factor is I have 5 older siblings, and so I don't think they were very restrictive with them either on that subject. None of them were hugely into movies, but they did in some phases. And I guess like my brother showed me Pulp Fiction, but I was like 13 or 14, right? It was not, I was at an age that was okay for that. So yeah, they were not restrictive, but yeah, I guess it just did not come up that much. And on the subject of ratings, I guess we have a slightly different system where it's just ages, right? So there's -10, well, so not under 10, sorry, only under, wait, what am I saying? Yeah, not under 10, not under 12, and not under 16. And then there's I guess an equivalent to NC-17, that's an X rating, that's basically porn and Gaspar Noé films, which I know that Lauren is apparently from a Gaspar Noé family, but yeah, I that is the only case, recent Gaspar Noé films that had issues with ratings in France. Generally, they're a little more liberal than the American system with sex. Though not that liberal. Again, like Love, the Gaspar Noé film, was deemed an X-rated film. And they're a little tougher with violence, right? So most superhero films are -10, sometimes -12. Anyway. But yeah, I don't think they're very strict with it in theaters in France. Obviously, I don't have an experience of trying it myself. In fact, I remember that hearing about The Exorcist, obviously it was not in theaters, but I knew it was a -12 film, and I heard about it, I was 11, and I remember being pretty happy that I could use that as an excuse not to see it. So that's what I was as a kid, right? So not the kid you needed to restrict, in terms of trying to see stuff that's too adult. But I guess we talked about this a bit, but since you all got into movies more through the DVDs and stuff, was there a point where you started going to the cinema regularly, or I guess maybe you never did? Because it's interesting that all of our first memories, well, not all, but I guess a lot of our first memories of film are related to the cinema, because obviously it's very striking, right, as a child to be in that big dark room. Yeah, I wonder, did you at some point start really going to the cinema regularly, or is it for you still mostly watching at home, I guess?
Well, Matthieu, I think you just betrayed the fact that you've come to the cinema rather recently by saying that we all got into it through DVDs. I think we all got into it through VHS, actually. We're
yes, sir.
children of the VHS era, which no longer exists for better or worse. And we're children of the video store era, which no longer exists for worse. I very much miss and loved video stores. But I want to be clear, I wouldn't say I got into movies through VHS. It was not one or the other. It was both video stores and going to the movies. And I don't know what the situation is where you guys grew up, but I was so very fortunate to grow up in New York City, which has just an unbelievable bounty of movie theaters. So many movie theaters showing recent releases, but also movie theaters showing international movies and art house movies and repertory cinemas. And so my family were always big movie goers. And I benefited from the fact that both my parents are cinephiles as well. We always went to the movies, and it's only really in the past 10 years that I've stopped going to the movies nearly as much. And especially, I think once I remember I was 18 or 17, excuse me, and I was just about to graduate from high school, and a new repertory cinema opened up here in New York called the Thalia Theater. It was actually a recreation of an old repertory cinema that had closed, and they opened with a series of classic French movies. And so I went there and I saw all these classic French movies like Rififi, Diabolique, The Sorrow and the Pity, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. So that was a fascinating experience, and that got me more into movies and opened my eyes to a whole new sort of sector of cinema. And then I continued doing it a lot when I got back from college. I went to all these repertory cinemas. I had a membership at Film Forum. I knew how to sneak into the Museum of Modern Art and go to their repertory cinema for free. And then I became very indulgent, and I would make lists every month of all the classic movies showing around the city that I wanted to see.
So I think the current question was about seeing films in theaters and whether it was all just about home video. I think for me it was a lot about home video. I've just been discussing in the chat, and just even the smell and the texture of VHS, I just love it. I've still got quite a few films on VHS, even though my VCR isn't hooked up in the new place that I moved into. I've got all the VHSs of stuff I haven't been able to upgrade, and it just brings back childhood memories. That's my fondest thing, going and wandering through the video store, looking at films, judging them based on their cover, because that's all that I could do, and, sometimes getting a really cool thing as a result of that. So a lot of it was discovery from me that way. A lot of it was discovery of things showing late night on TV, a lot of the older classics. In terms of going to the movies, yeah, that's probably always been an issue for me in terms of distance and expense. For quite a while, I was living for like the last 10 years or so quite far away from any theatres. I'm actually a bit closer to a cinema now. But even so, it's not, my number one avenue to go and watch films. There was definitely a time when I was at university where I actually would watch films quite regularly, because the university that I was at was actually quite close to a cinema that's now shut down and been transformed into a live theatre or something of that sort. It hasn't been completely shut down, but it's not what it was. But yeah, I used to go there because I'd have a lecture in the morning and I'd have something in the evening or whatever. And I'll fit in a film in between. So that was kind of nice for a little bit. There was one stage, I guess, maybe 2005, 2006, where I was really into discussing the latest releases on the IMDb message boards. So I'd go out and see, as many of those as I can by myself during, the Oscar buzz season. But no, in general, I don't think going to the cinema has been a big part of it. It's always something I enjoy, I like. Like I said, I do still like wandering up to that big screen like a little kid and looking at that big screen and seeing how massive it is and just the whole environment of it. But yeah, as bad as it seems as a cinephile, the actual cinema experience, it's never been as big for me as home video and watching things on TV, which is probably why, as discussed in a Netflix podcast, I'm not so apprehensive about cinemas eventually shutting down, everything being streaming services. I just see it as evolution.
Oh, that would break my heart. So, like you, I also had that sort of sense of wonder when going into a movie theater as a young child. It just felt like this sort of monumental, special place. So I would dearly miss movie theaters, even though I don't go to them that often anymore.
Yeah, so I never really got into the cinema. When I was a teen, I went a lot more because Dad, again, would be like, oh, let's go see this latest release, and he would bring us. And that was probably between 2003 and 2008-ish. And that's sort of when I graduated high school, and then I was sort of doing stuff on my own. Most of the time, the stuff that was playing at the cinema I didn't want to see. And also with Australia, back in the day, our release times for films would be like months later than, say, America. So by the time something was available illegally online, it would still not be out in the cinemas here. So it was like, well, I'm not going to wait 3-4 months to see this film. And it just wasn't like a great selection. I always wanted to pick what I wanted to see and not have like, you can choose from these 10 films at these specific times, because I don't know if I'm going to want to feel like that. I feel like watching that at that time. So yeah, I think as a teen, we probably went a couple times a month. And now the last few years, I go maybe a couple times a year. And the only time I really make an effort to go is if there's a horror festival around, because otherwise I'm just not really that interested. And if I can watch it at home where I'm comfortable, don't have to put on clothes, I can pause and whatever, then I'm going to watch it at home.
I might just mention that I actually have, until COVID hit, started going to the cinema more regularly. It become part of, my weekly or bi-weekly routine, just because, living away from home or whatever, it would be a time where I could catch up with my parents, would have a meal and would go see a movie together. When COVID had shut cinemas down, that sort of, died off a little bit. And, there's been a few times we've gone out and we've seen something like we saw Nomadland together and some other stuff that appealed to them. But, up until the COVID closures, I was actually going maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks to the movies with my parents, just as a catch-up thing. So that sort of, came in maybe the last 5 years or so. But there was definitely a good period after, I guess, graduating uni, where I just really wasn't going to the movies that much.
Yeah, so I ask this question because for me, probably as a result of being an adult or a young adult, when I got into films, I was a student in Lyon, which is a pretty big city. And so I had access to a lot of movie theaters that were showing a lot of different films. I wasn't really seeing that many older films. They did once a week a cult movie, they call it, but cult really just means old. So I saw a few Hitchcocks actually for the first time that way. But yeah, for me, it was really important. And you might even argue that part of why I watched a lot of classic films, older films, was in order to have a better understanding of cinema and to be able to have a more informed opinion of current films, right? I guess because there's this thing in France where I've talked about this before, where cinemas offer basically for a monthly fee, you get to see however many films you want in a certain chain of theaters. So yeah, I really wanted to be part of the conversation, have an idea of what the current good films are. And yeah, again, started watching older films in big part to understand and to have a more informed opinion. And what you guys mentioned about COVID and Adam about suddenly having access to a lot of small theaters doing older films, it's actually what I'm doing right now, because as of this recording, cinemas have reopened since 3 weeks, here in France. And now I live near Paris. And really, this period of theaters being closed has made me really fear that all of these small theaters that still exist would disappear. And they haven't. And so now I'm really, really enthusiastic into watching these older films in theaters. It's really reinvigorated my desire to go see them, and I've done it a bit, and to take this opportunity. And in that sense, I guess the closure of cinemas has made the hardcore fonder for me.
Something that I thought I'd probe into and see whether it's the case for anyone else, I know it's the case for Lauren at least, is whether you've done any extra study in film and how that's changed your appreciation. Because the first degree that I did before education actually was in film and video, and definitely some of the lectures and some of the courses that I did, some of them a bit reluctantly, did deepen my appreciation and widen my scope of what I was into. So I'm just wondering how that might have changed for anybody else.
Well, I already mentioned, seeing some movies in high school and class, like Agira, The Wrath of God, which is very influential. But in terms of more sort of formal academic experiences, I took one class in college on film. It was not a college where you could take film production or really major in film as a course of study, but I took one class. And it was a class where I definitely learned some things in terms of cinematic terminology and cinematic techniques. I learned about, I learned terms like a two-shot or a match cut. These were things I learned about. But on the whole, I did not like that class very much. As is all too common among university lecturers, I found the professors highly pompous and thus not very informative. But then in grad school, I became much more involved in studying film because I went to grad school to study history with a focus on film. I want to be clear, I didn't go to study film history. It wasn't a degree in film studies. It was a degree in history with an interest in American cultural history and especially American cinema. So when I was there, I began studying film much more heavily and reading a lot of film history, not just in terms of reading the history of movies, but reading the history of cinematic culture. I read a book, for example, about traveling exhibitions that went to small towns in America in the early 1900s. Or I remember reading a great article about the popularity of, there was a certain type of film exhibition, and I'm talking about, 1904 or something, where they would just show a camera shot from the front of a train. And they would be exhibited in small movie theaters that were designed as if you were sitting in a train yourself. This was a small but popular sort of fad in the cinema experience in the very early days. So that was the kind of cultural history I was learning about. And I also took, some classes specifically in film studies. I very quickly discovered I really wasn't into sort of film studies as a separate academic course of study. I think that's where you get much more theoretical and again, tends to get much more pompous. But there was a lot to learn and I very much enjoyed learning about it.
So I also studied history, but again, because I came to cinema very late, I didn't really take those courses into film history or into the culture of cinema as related to history. Because when I really got into films, I was already just barely postgraduate. And at that point, I was very focused on passing an exam, which is an exam you need to pass to teach in France. And so obviously that didn't leave any room for really exploring other stuff. I really had to study what was on that exam. And yeah, it's a big regret actually. And I kind of would like to do it, but I would never get the time. So yeah, I didn't, but I wish I had is my answer.
When I was in high school, I really did not ever want to study film. I was dead set against it because whenever we had when we were studying a film in high school, it would be the teacher would say, okay, these are the themes and the symbolism and whatever. And you have to basically regurgitate everything I just said. And we don't really want any of your opinions or your interpretations. It was stick to this. And I was just yeah, that sucks. So I was really, really against any kind of academic study of film. But eventually I did go to film school, that was production based, in 2015, 2016. And I got a diploma of screen and media. And it didn't really do much on theory, but it really made me realize how much goes into production. And I mean, film students are terrible, and school productions are terrible. But there was just so many things I didn't even know about, things like taking Atmos and even just doing so many multiple takes. I knew that every scene would have multiple takes. I just didn't realize how many, or from so many different types of angles and stuff. So it really kind of opened my eyes to the nature of production of films, which I just hadn't really thought about before. But I hated production. So then I went to uni and I got a Bachelor of Arts in Screen Studies, which was theory based. I loved that. And my lecturers were actually not pompous at all. They were really good. They were the complete opposite of my high school teachers. They were we want your opinions. We want you to engage with the readings that we're giving you and the topics that we're covering, but we want you to, put yourself into it as well. And most of the stuff that we covered, I already sort of knew, but it helped me contextualize a lot of it. It also made me realize or look into different aspects of film that I wouldn't have before, say tying it into philosophy and psychology and that kind of stuff. Whether I agree with it or not the point, but I didn't realize that the sort of intricacies that were kind of people would use for criticism of films and reading films. And it did help me with some of the language and sort of putting my thoughts together, but I found it so exhausting, which is why I just do really simple comments now, because I don't feel like getting into a 1,500 word essay for every film. But yeah, it really helped me learn that kind of stuff. But in terms of opening up my eyes to different film or seeing it in a different way, it didn't do that at all. But it did, I guess, help me. I can sort of take a step back and see the film a bit more objectively. It doesn't affect my opinion, but I can kind of sit back a little bit more and think of maybe what they were attempting. And it also helped me learn a little bit more about certain parts of history or culture that I didn't know about before either.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear you guys talk about your own experiences with learning about film. Like Lauren, I did what was called media in high school, but a lot of it wasn't theory. In fact, most of it wasn't. It was more production based. Like the number one thing that I remember doing is we had to recreate a shot from the opening of a film. And the one that I managed to choose was Billy Elliot, which has him jumping up and down. And my best friend who was doing it with me refused to jump up and down because he thought it would make him look stupid. So we had to like sort of experiment and get the camera to like move up and down. And if it was like moving up and down, it had like the sort of impression of him going through the air. So some early trickery in there. But yeah, a lot of it was mainly production. When I got into university, a lot of it was theory based. But I guess by that stage, I found the theory quite interesting. I did theory units as well as production units. The production part, like Lauren said, was very interesting, was very insightful, seeing just how much effort goes into there, things you don't think about, like white balancing, making sure you've got enough reaction shots when you're doing a documentary in case you need to cut away. But yeah, the production side, yeah, was always a little bit taxing for me. It was very hard working with and coordinating with other people. So I ended up just finishing off the degree by doing theory units, which didn't really end up taking me anywhere, but it gave me quite a wide appreciation for different parts of cinema. Like before university, I was never very much into documentaries. I was actually at the stage where I wouldn't like go and see documentaries in cinema. Like I think the only one I'd seen was like Bowling for Columbine, but beyond that, I had like no interest in documentaries. And then I was shown the films of Frederick Wiseman. I was shown the films of Nicholas Broomfield, where he actually puts his personality into the documentary. It becomes equally about him as it is about the subject. And just seeing different things like Louis Buñuel films beyond Un Chien Andalou, which I think every cinema film buff sees early on, but just seeing some other films he's done like Belle Jour, L'Arc d'Or, and really getting into cinema that way. I just found, I had a much wider appreciation by the end of my film course. Like Lauren said, it did get to the stage where you'd be able to write something quite in depth, and the film reviews that I was writing, I guess, towards the end of my film degree, maybe 2006, 2007, were quite lengthy, like paragraph long reviews, like paragraphs on end. And I just can't do that these days. So like, I don't just do a few words. I usually do about 150 words. But the stuff that I was writing, I've got some of them saved somewhere in my computer for ages ago. You know, I'd be doing like a 500 like word essay, basically, just posting what I'd seen on Classic Film Board and nobody responding to it. I guess it got to the point where I was like, I don't know if it's worth writing all this or whatever. So my analysis has dropped down a little bit since, you know, finishing the film degree, getting into education, starting my career elsewhere. But it's definitely was a big influence on me. And even though I'd seen more than other people, like the lecturers would often like come up to me and like, not come up to me, but they'll sort of like ask me during a lecture, you know, if I knew about this or whatever, because I had a lot of knowledge there.
Did you guys ever consider, I guess it sounds like you considered having a career in cinema, like working in actual cinema? Because I never did, maybe because it was later, but yeah, I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I thought I would at one point. I mean, originally when I left school, I actually started doing law because I got good enough grades to do that. And everyone's like, oh, you're a good public speaker, so, you know, you should do this or whatever. You've got the grades high enough to get into it. I'm like, yeah, okay. So I had to have law as my major and I had to have a minor, something else secondary that I was studying also. So I decided to do a film and video unit. And even though it wasn't really great compared to what I did when I switched campuses and went to a different university, it was definitely interesting enough that I decided, look, I don't want to do this law stuff. It's really boring and it's a lot of reading about things that aren't too interesting. How about I switch careers or whatever? And I got into film and I originally thought, you know, look, I'll be doing some production stuff. And then I did the production unit. Production's really hard because you're working with so many different people, getting so many ideas out there, organizing everything, white balancing everything. It was something where I decided I didn't want to do a career in, so I thought, well, maybe I'll get into film theory. I ended up doing honors and doing a thesis about a topic that was far less interesting at the end of it than I thought at the beginning of it. And at the end of that, I was like, yeah, no, I'm not doing this, which is, yeah, when I switched to education. But, it's come a bit, 360 now, because some of the stuff I'm doing now, I'm actually teaching kids how to film. So I'm sort of using that backing that I had before. But so I am doing stuff at the moment that's actually related to cinema, which is quite interesting, but it's not, the production side that I did at one stage, thought that I'd be getting into.
What is it that you're working on, Saul?
Sorry, can you rephrase that? I'm not sure.
You say you're currently working on something.
No, just with the what I'm teaching students at the moment. I'm actually teaching, film and video or film and video skills or photography and video skills at a primary school level. So it's a specialist position. And yeah, actually I teach kids about how to make a film, how to make a documentary, how to have, reaction shots in there, how to re-record voices. And yeah, it's all quite interesting. So like what I've learned at university is sort of like factoring in because it's actually part of the primary school curriculum. Whereas when I grew up, it was just, part of the high school curriculum. So yeah, it's quite interesting. What I've learned, is still useful for me, but it's not what I envisioned when I enrolled in university. I thought, well, maybe I'll actually get out there and make films that would be released at cinemas. But, that was the dream and this is the reality. And the reality isn't too bad.
I didn't really go into my degree thinking I was going to get a career in film. I just thought I really love this thing and I want to study it. So I'm going to go study it. While I was there, I did consider getting into editing, but then my RSI started and I realized there was just no way that I was going to be able to do that. And then I just realized I hated production. Like Saul was saying, coordinating everything and being on set is 90% waiting and it's really boring. It's really physical. It's like a trade. And I was just I don't want to do a trade. And then with the theory, I find it really fun, but as a hobby and as an interest, not as a career. I couldn't really imagine having deadlines for writing a film review or a film essay or something like that. I just, no, can't bother with that. But it was just something I wanted to do. And I thought, well, I want to learn the broad skills from university. And I might as well do it studying something I like. Whether it will have any impact on whatever career I end up with, I don't know. I doubt it, but it was still fun to do.
For me, I can't say I've really seriously considered a career in cinema, except I would say I considered a career in history of film, so it's sort of an academic career. The closest, though, I ever came was, when I was a teenager, I went to summer camp. I don't know if summer camp is something that is popular in Australia or France, but it's quite popular here in the Northeast United States. And the summer camp I went to had a video production. I don't know, I guess you call it program. And that was a ton of fun. It was totally free. They just gave us kids some video equipment and a very basic editing console and said, do whatever you want. And we did, ridiculous things. We had a camp news show. We put together this sort of ongoing murder mystery serial. We did a lot of satire. We decided to do a satire mashup of Forrest Gump with Die Hard 3. It was called Forrest Dump with a Vengeance. It was a very silly endeavor. So that was fun. And that influenced me enough that when I was a senior in high school, I briefly had an internship at a production company, a very small documentary-focused production company called Storyville Films. They mainly do arts-focused documentaries about music or about theater. At the time, the one I worked on, they did a documentary about a fairly well-known playwright in the United States named Susan Laurie Park. So that was the one I worked on. They're most famous for, they had a short documentary that is nominated for an Academy Award called Sister Rose's Passion. I didn't work on that one. But working at that production company, I quickly realized that I had no interest in working in film production, especially at the lowest levels. It is dreary. It's a lot of waiting around and doing nothing. Most of my time I was doing transcription. I don't know if you guys have done transcription. It is achingly boring. So no, I did not ever really seriously consider a career in film after that.
I think the most boring thing that I've done on a film was one of the projects we're doing was continuity. I think it was continuity and I was set decorator. I don't know how I got those things shifted to me. And I was trying to do all these small things, whatever, to make it interesting, but you couldn't actually really tell at the end of it how I'd put all these different things in the set there because it was just like so subtle. And the continuity was kind of interesting, but the team I was working with were so pedantic, there wasn't really that much to pick up on.
As far as summer camp goes, Adam, we do have those in France, but as I was a nerdy kid, so I went to science-based summer camps. We did like rockets and programmed video games and stuff like that. Not so much with the Forrest Gump parodies. But that sounds fun too. And yeah, so I never considered, definitely never considered being involved in production. That does not sound like I think at all in any way. Being a critic, that would be maybe fun, but it's definitely a bit late for that, I think. Well, I don't know, I guess. But anyway, I never considered it as a career, more like Lauren said, more as a hobby. Anyway, what I want to close on is to ask you, where is your cinephilia at this point? What is still motivating you, if anything, to watch films? Are you trying to close some gaps, right? See some blind spots, or are you more interested in what's coming out, or, what is still driving you to see movies at this point?
What else would I do with my time? I don't know. I mean, it's still something that interests me greatly. I'd say that as I've, become much more indulgent in my cinephilia as an adult, as I've gone from watching maybe, 4 movies a week to watching 7 movies a week, I'd say the passion I once felt as a child has dimmed a bit. And that's unfortunate. I think it's inevitable with any interest. I also think it's inevitable as part of growing older. But the fact that it's still there, that I still watch a lot of movies, not nearly as much as Sol or Lauren when she's really going, but I still, watch much more movies than my friends. That's testament to the fact that it is such a major passion of mine. And I feel like I watch a lot of movies that are disappointing these days, but occasionally you just come across that movie that really surprises and delights you, and it's still a magical experience to me.
In terms of what motivates me, now I've said before with the lists on iCheck movies that I'm not too, passionate about, trying to get platinum awards on them and complete them. What does interest me a lot, though, are the rankings that you get for official checks. And at the moment, I'm doing a bit of a leapfrog game with Lauren at the moment, where she's just above me in the ranks, but I was just above her a few weeks ago before she checked a ton of shorts to try and get ahead of me. So the rankings do keep me going, but, look, in general, my, I don't know how to describe it, my sense of wonderment with iCheck movies has gone down over the years. I don't hold it in quite the same esteem that I once did. So the main thing that really motivates me is probably the official challenges on the ICM forum, because they give me a focus of what to watch rather than just choosing anything out there. I've got 3 different themes that I can choose from each month. And then I get, super competitive when I see other people watching more stuff than me, and we've got an official leaderboard going on where if you finish in the top 5 or top 10 or top 20, you get so many points. So that at the moment is doing it for me. I don't know how long it will last for because I'm watching a very large volume of films. Since I've joined the ICM forum and got interested in the challenges, I've gone from watching maybe 600 films a year to 1,200. I watched 1,230 during last year. That's feature films, not shorts. So I'm obviously watching a very large volume of it. So I don't know if that's sustainable long term, but at the moment, the challenges are keeping me interested. I don't know how long for, but yeah, for the moment, you're just that competitive thing, having those set themes, the themes changing each month is enough to keep me going.
So can I just ask you about that? Gamification, I understand, is a big appeal. And I'm certainly not one who looks down on gamification at all. I think it's a lot of fun. But there must be something more, right? There must be something edifying to you intellectually or spiritually or something, from the movies themselves that you get out of them?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the big competition with Lauren is that we're both from Perth, so I'm trying to be the Perth user with the highest rank on ICM. In terms of what that does for me, I don't know. I guess not much. I don't really expect people to respect my film opinions more if I'm higher ranked. I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying that because that was something which another user threw out a couple of years ago with trying to get into the top 25 on ICM. So, yeah, I'm not sure if it's a spiritual thing or whatever. I guess I enjoy seeing my rank go up, but it's also a bit hard because at the same time I've sort of, lost a little bit of faith in the process of the way I check movies has run. I've seen a bit of the behind the scenes stuff and the way that it's become, a curated selection and it's all about attracting new users and not so much, catering towards the established user base. It's not something that, I'm set on saying, well, this is my goal for life. 4 years ago it was when I first joined iCheck Movies. I'm like, this is going to be, my road, towards, watching films for quite a while. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just my competitive nature. I mean, even with the challenges that we're doing at the moment, if I get in the top 5, get in the top 10, yeah, I get a few points. It doesn't really do anything for me. So I don't know if it's just that pleasure of seeing my name in bright lights or whatever. If I get a high ranking in one of the challenges, maybe it's something to do with that. I don't know. We call it serotonin or whatever that sort of like thing you get when you get like that sort of ding on your iPhone. I don't know if it's like that. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a sense of self-satisfaction, but then it's also a sense of, how much time am I squandering doing this? So that's my roundabout way of, okay, the thing is dopamine. Thank you, French pronunciation, please, for helping with my English pronunciation that I'm no good with. Yeah, it's my roundabout way of not answering Adam's question.
Yeah, lately well, over the last few years, my obsessions kind of died down. So I just kind of watch stuff when I feel like it. But I was the number one ICMer from Perth since 2009. So I'm very keen on stopping my nemesis from beating me in the ranks at the moment. But earlier this year, I went 3 months without watching a film just because I was pretty stressed with uni, but I just wasn't in the mood. And then I just thought, I'll start just working on my closest awards and stuff. And then that just sparked my interest again. I find, when I start to sort of lose interest, if I start to focus on something, I'll be really into it for a while and then I'll get bored and then I'll be interested in something else. I just can't stick to sort of one thing, but I do like to have a focus when I'm watching film. But even if I'm not watching films, quite like just reading about film. I never used to, but then when I mentioned this in another podcast, but when I was starting to gather lists and reviews for They Shoot Zombies, I got really into reading what other people were saying about films. And before that, I was kind of just I don't care. So now, even when I'm not watching, I'm always reading or listening or something. I'm always doing something film related. It doesn't just have to be watching it for me. So that's kind of where I'm at, I guess. I just kind of if I feel like it, I'll watch stuff. And if not, I'll read stuff.
What about you, Matthieu?
Well, in terms of the ICM rankings, I don't care much about it, but that's probably just because I'm not even in the same galaxy as you guys. So it's easier not to care when you're losing, probably. But yeah, that's not really my goal. I guess to me, the thing that motivates me in life for most things is to try to understand the world, to get a better understanding of it. That's why I studied history and geography. And film for me is another way to do that. It's also a way to entertain myself, of course, but I guess that's the primary thing. And so I'm always trying to get a better understanding both of the medium and of other cultures, other times, etc. One of the things that's going on currently is that, for me, I got into film mostly through English-based media, English-based lists and critics, etc. And so I noticed at some point that when I read or listened to French critics, they would treat some films as being these very big deal films that basically don't register for English critics or American critics. And so lately I've been trying to kind of be more diligent about watching many French classics. But in the long term, the goal is to kind of dip everywhere, kind of have a more global and more universal knowledge, which is obviously impossible, but trending towards that of cinema. And I'm still really into new releases. I think more than most people participating in this podcast, or be this particular one or the previous ones. I really enjoyed being into what is being talked about now, because that's a way to connect with people who are not that much into movies, because they hear about the big films like Saul, you mentioned Nomadland, right? Seeing that, having an opinion about it is also a way for me to interact with people, which I find very enjoyable. So yeah, that would be where I'm at. And I think with that, we can end this episode. So thank you for listening, and join us again soon.
Oh, and if you thought I could go one episode without at least making a cameo appearance, you'd be quite wrong. And just remind everyone that this is indeed a follow-up to our very first episode of all time, How We Got Into Cinema, where all of the original hosts shared our entryway into the world of cinema. For anyone interested in comparing these episodes and seeing who did better, was it the original or was it indeed the remake, go back to our very first episode and find out for yourself. And of course, drop by the forum and tell us which you prefer and how you got into cinema. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.